Imagine knowing that a place exists where people are sent and almost no one ever returns. No letters, no witnesses, no bodies. Only rumors, whispers of starvation, of beatings, of something far worse than a prison. In 1940, Europe was already at war. Cities were burning, armies were clashing. But somewhere in occupied Poland, a new kind of darkness was taking shape. It was called Auschwitz. At the time, the world did not yet know what that name would come to mean. There were no photographs, no reports confirmed by governments, only silence and fear. The Polish resistance needed the truth, not guesses, not theories, facts. And that's when one man did something no one else would dare to suggest. He didn't plan an escape, he didn't launch an attack, he didn't wait for orders. He chose to go inside, voluntarily. He knew the chances of survival were almost zero. He knew torture was likely. He knew death was the most probable outcome. But he also knew something else. If no one entered that place and came back alive, the world would never believe what was happening there. That man's name was Witold Pilecki. And this is the true story of the man who willingly walked into hell.
Before the war, Witold Pilecki was not a symbol. He was not a legend. He was not a man seeking martyrdom. He was an ordinary Polish army officer. He had a home, a wife, children waiting for him to return in the evenings. He enjoyed riding horses. He cared about routine, discipline, and quiet stability. He planned for a future that assumed life would continue. In other words, he was a man with reasons to survive. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, that life collapsed almost overnight. The army was defeated, the government fled, the country disappeared from the map. Like thousands of others, Pilecki went underground. He forged documents, moved between safe houses, carried messages, organized resistance cells. Nothing about this made him unique. What made him different was how far he was willing to go. By 1940, rumors began spreading through the resistance about a camp in southern Poland, a place where people were sent and never heard from again. Some believed it was just another prison. Others suspected forced labor, but no one knew for sure. Information was the most valuable weapon the resistance had, and Auschwitz was a complete black hole. Meetings were held, ideas were discussed, plans were proposed, and then Pilecki spoke. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't dramatize it. He simply said that someone had to go inside, someone had to see it firsthand, someone had to report back. The room went silent. Everyone understood what he was suggesting, and everyone understood what it meant. This was not a mission designed for success. It was a mission designed for truth. And Witold Pilecki volunteered. Not because he wanted to die, but because he believed that some truths were worth risking everything for.
In 1940, the word Auschwitz meant almost nothing. It was not a symbol. It was not a warning. It was not yet associated with mass death. To most people, it was just the name of a town. But within the Polish underground, something was wrong. People were being arrested. Intellectuals, soldiers, teachers, students. They were sent south. And then they vanished. No letters arrived. No names appeared on prisoner lists. No released detainees returned with stories. There were no photographs, no intercepted documents, no confirmed reports. Only absence, only silence. Rumors began to circulate quietly between resistance cells. Whispers passed from courier to courier. Some said the camp was brutal. Others said it was designed to break people through labor and starvation. A few claimed executions were taking place, but no one could prove anything. And without proof, the outside world would never act. The underground resistance understood one thing very clearly: ignorance was deadly. If Auschwitz was only a prison, it could be survived. If it was something worse, every day of delay meant more lives lost. But Auschwitz was a closed system, a sealed space. No observers, no journalists, no neutral witnesses. The only way to know the truth was to enter it. At a resistance meeting in Warsaw, the question was raised carefully. Could someone allow themselves to be captured? Could someone survive long enough to report back? No one spoke at first. Everyone understood the odds. Entering the camp meant starvation, torture, disease. It meant a high probability of death and a near certainty of suffering. And then Witold Pilecki broke the silence. He didn't frame it as heroism. He didn't speak in dramatic terms. He simply said that if no one ever came out alive, then he would try. Not because he believed he was stronger than others, but because someone had to turn rumors into facts, and because the truth, once documented, could no longer be ignored. In September 1940, German forces carried out routine street roundups in Warsaw. They were chaotic by design, random, brutal. Entire streets were sealed off. Men were pulled from doorways, cafes, tram stops. No explanations were given. For most people, being caught meant terror. For Witold Pilecki, it meant something else. That morning, he made a deliberate choice. He left his safe house. He carried no forged papers, no identification, no protection. He walked directly into the streets where German patrols were already gathering civilians. When the soldiers stopped him, he did not resist. He did not explain. He did not attempt to escape. He was arrested on the spot. The beating came quickly. Rifle butts, shouted orders. Blows meant to establish dominance, not justice. Then came the transport. Hundreds of men were forced into cattle cars, designed for animals, not humans. There was no room to sit, little air, no water. The doors were slammed shut. For hours, then days, the train moved east. Men collapsed where they stood. Some did not survive the journey. No one knew where they were going. And then the train stopped. The doors opened. Barbed wire stretched across the horizon. Watchtowers rose above the fences. Armed guards stood waiting. This was Auschwitz. Inside the camp, everything that defined a person was stripped away. Names were replaced, clothes were taken, heads were shaved. There were no ranks, no titles, no past lives, only a number. For Witold Pilecki, that number was 4859. From that moment on, he officially ceased to exist as a man. He became a prisoner, and he had just entered the most dangerous phase of his mission, one he might never leave alive.
Auschwitz did not usually kill people immediately. That would have been inefficient. Instead, it broke them. From the first hours inside the camp, the system was clear. Hunger was constant, not occasional, not accidental. Prisoners received just enough food to remain alive, never enough to remain human. Beatings were routine, not as punishment, but as instruction, a reminder that pain could arrive at any moment for any reason. Humiliation was deliberate. Men were forced to stand naked in the cold for hours, to obey contradictory orders, to be punished for mistakes they could not avoid. But the most destructive weapon was psychological. The camp was designed to turn prisoners against each other. Food was scarce, so men fought for it. Survival was individual, so solidarity disappeared. Fear was everywhere, so betrayal became tempting. Some prisoners informed on others to gain favor. Some stole from the weak. Some learned to look away. Not because they were evil, but because the system rewarded it. Within days, many lost their sense of self. They stopped thinking in terms of weeks or months. They stopped imagining a future. Life became a sequence of hours, then minutes, then moments. It was during these first days that Witold Pilecki understood something critical. Auschwitz was not built only to kill bodies. It was built to isolate, to ensure that every prisoner believed he was alone. And Pilecki realized the truth that would shape everything that followed. If every man tried to survive on his own, no one would survive for long. But if even small groups formed, if trust could exist even briefly, the system could be resisted, quietly, carefully, from the inside. This understanding did not make survival easier, but it made resistance possible. And in a place designed to erase all resistance, that realization was revolutionary. Creating resistance inside Auschwitz was not a dramatic act. There were no meetings, no speeches, no symbols. Everything had to be invisible. Witold Pilecki began the only way possible, slowly. One man, then another, then a third. He watched people carefully, not for bravery, but for discipline, not for anger, but for restraint. Former soldiers who understood silence, doctors who knew how to help without being seen, engineers who could fix, alter, or sabotage small systems without drawing attention. No one knew the full network. No one asked unnecessary questions. Each person knew only what they needed to know. Food was shared quietly, a piece of bread here, a ladle of soup there. Not enough to attract suspicion, but enough to keep someone alive. Lists were altered when possible. Names were shifted. Numbers were adjusted. A man scheduled for a deadly work detail might suddenly be reassigned. Another marked for selection might disappear from a list entirely. Warnings were passed in whispers, a word, a gesture, a glance at the right moment. Enough to tell someone to hide, enough to tell someone to prepare, enough to save a life, sometimes. Doctors worked without tools, without medicine, without protection. They treated infections with scraps of cloth, set bones by hand, performed care that could not be recorded. Every action carried the same consequence if discovered: public execution, starvation, collective punishment, not only for the individual, but for everyone connected to him. And yet, the network grew, not quickly, not boldly, but steadily. In a place designed to eliminate cooperation, these small acts of trust were acts of defiance. Auschwitz was meant to reduce men to numbers. This underground did the opposite. It remembered names, it preserved dignity, and it proved that even inside a system built for total control, human organization was still possible.
Over time, Witold Pilecki began to understand that Auschwitz was not evolving by accident. It was expanding with purpose. New facilities appeared. Security increased. Transports arrived more frequently. Entire groups of prisoners were unloaded and never registered. They were not assigned numbers. They were not sent to barracks. They were simply removed. Pilecki and others witnessed the process from a distance. They saw buildings disguised as showers. They saw people led inside in groups. They saw smoke rising shortly afterward. They noticed patterns. Days when thousands arrived, followed by nights when the camp fell unnaturally silent. This was no longer forced labor. This was industrialized killing. What made Auschwitz different was scale. Executions were not occasional. They were systematic. Gas chambers allowed mass murder without gunfire. Crematoria operated continuously. Bodies were reduced to ash within hours. Pilecki understood that what he was seeing had no historical precedent. And he understood something else. If this information remained inside the camp, it would vanish with the people who carried it. So he began to document everything. Not on paper, that was too dangerous, but in memory. Numbers, dates, descriptions. He reconstructed reports piece by piece, then passed them to trusted couriers working in camp workshops or transport details. Those messages traveled through multiple hands, across occupied territory, toward London. By 1941 and 1942, Pilecki's reports described the existence of gas chambers, the mass extermination of Jews and other prisoners, the killing of thousands of people per day, the transformation of Auschwitz into a death factory. These were not rumors, they were eyewitness accounts. They became some of the first detailed reports of the Holocaust ever received by the Allied governments. But there was a problem. The truth was too extreme. Officials who read the reports struggled to comprehend them. Some believed the numbers were exaggerated. Others assumed the accounts were distorted by trauma. Mass murder on this scale seemed impossible. Yet inside Auschwitz, it was already routine. While the world debated whether to believe the reports, the camp continued to operate, efficiently, quietly, relentlessly. And Pilecki remained inside, watching history's darkest crime unfold, knowing that the clock was working against him. Eventually, the reports made their way out of occupied Poland. They passed through resistance channels, across borders, through coded messages and intermediaries, and finally, they reached London. They were read by Allied officials, analyzed, filed. The documents described gas chambers, mass executions, thousands of people murdered every single day. And the reaction was not outrage, it was disbelief. Some readers assumed the reports were exaggerated. Others believed they were the result of panic or trauma. A few suspected deliberate misinformation. They had never seen anything like this before.
War crimes were known, mass shootings had been documented, but industrialized murder, designed, organized, and executed with bureaucratic efficiency, seemed beyond reason. The numbers were simply too large, the methods too systematic, the implications too disturbing. Accepting the reports would have meant accepting a reality that demanded immediate action, action that was politically complicated, militarily risky, and strategically inconvenient. So doubt became a form of comfort. It was easier to believe that Witold Pilecki was mistaken, easier to assume the camp was brutal but not unprecedented, easier to delay. The reports were not dismissed outright. They were set aside, filed as unconfirmed, labeled as requiring further verification. While officials debated credibility and feasibility, Auschwitz continued to function exactly as designed. Trains kept arriving, gas chambers kept operating, smoke kept rising into the sky. The truth was not rejected because it was false. It was rejected because it was unbearable. And inside the camp, Pilecki understood the consequences of that hesitation. Every day of disbelief meant thousands more lives erased.
By 1943, Witold Pilecki understood a brutal truth. If he died inside Auschwitz, the truth would die with him. The reports he had sent were no longer enough. They were being questioned, delayed, doubted. If the world refused to act on written testimony, then someone had to leave the camp and speak in person. That decision carried its own risk. Escape from Auschwitz was considered nearly impossible. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, armed patrols. Captured escapees were publicly executed. Their entire work units were punished in retaliation. But Pilecki had spent years preparing. In 1943, he was assigned to work in the camp bakery, one of the few locations with limited outside access and night shifts. He chose his moment carefully. One night, while working alongside other prisoners, Pilecki and his accomplices acted. A guard was quietly overpowered. Telephone and alarm lines were cut. Keys were taken. Seconds mattered. Gunfire erupted as they ran. Bullets tore through the darkness. Searchlights swept across open ground. They ran without knowing whether the next step would be their last. Against the odds, they reached the outer perimeter. They crossed fields. They hid in forests. They moved until exhaustion forced them to stop. After 947 days inside Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki was free. Physically, but freedom did not bring relief, because now he carried something far heavier than fear. He carried proof, and he knew that escaping the camp was only the beginning of a far more difficult battle. Convincing the world to finally listen. Freedom did not mean rest. Almost immediately after escaping, Witold Pilecki began writing again. This time, there were no rumors, no second-hand accounts. There was only direct testimony. He described what he had seen with precision: the structure of the camp, the locations of the gas chambers, the rhythm of transports and executions. He named dates, he estimated numbers, he explained how Auschwitz functioned as a system. And once again, he made the same request: strike the camp, disrupt the process, stop the killing. He proposed options: an attack from the air, a coordinated uprising from within, support for a large-scale prisoner revolt. It was not desperation, it was calculation. Pilecki understood that every option carried risk, but he also understood that inaction carried certainty. The response was silence. Not because officials doubted him anymore, but because the war had its own priorities. Resources were limited, strategic targets were chosen elsewhere, decisions were filtered through politics, alliances, and timing. Auschwitz was acknowledged, but it was not made central. The camp remained operational. Trains continued to arrive, people continued to disappear, smoke continued to rise. Pilecki had done everything a single human being could do. He had entered the camp voluntarily, survived nearly 3 years inside it, escaped, delivered proof, and still the machinery of death continued uninterrupted. This was the cruelest realization of all: that even the truth, clearly seen and carefully documented, does not always change the course of events. Sometimes history moves forward, fully aware of what it is destroying. When the war ended,
Witold Pilecki was finally free to choose. Many of his comrades left Poland. They understood what was coming. He did not. Pilecki believed that surviving the war gave him a responsibility to stay, to help rebuild, to serve his country one last time. Poland, however, was no longer free. A new regime had taken control, backed by Soviet power, built on surveillance, loyalty tests, and fear. Men like Pilecki, independent, experienced, impossible to fully control, were no longer heroes. They were threats. In 1947, he was arrested, not publicly, quietly. He was accused of espionage, of betrayal, of working against the state he had risked everything to defend. Interrogations followed. They were systematic, calculated, relentless. Beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure designed to break, not to investigate. Those who later saw him said the torture he endured after the war was worse than anything he had suffered in Auschwitz. Still, he refused to confess to crimes he had not committed. The trial was a formality. The verdict was decided in advance. In May 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed with a single shot to the back of the head. No grave was marked, no funeral was allowed. His name was erased from public record. For decades, speaking about him was forbidden. The man who willingly entered hell to tell the truth was silenced by the country he never stopped serving.
After his execution, it was as if Witold Pilecki had never existed. His name was removed from records. His reports were hidden. His story was forbidden. For decades, speaking about him in Poland was dangerous. He was not mentioned in schools, not honored in public, not remembered in official history. The man who had entered Auschwitz by choice, who organized resistance inside a death camp, who delivered some of the first eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust, was erased. Not by time, by design. A generation grew up without knowing his name, without knowing that one individual had tried to warn the world when warning still mattered. It was only after the fall of communism that the silence began to break. Documents resurfaced, testimonies were re-examined, his reports were finally read without censorship, and slowly the truth returned. Not as propaganda, not as legend, but as history. A reminder that courage does not always end in victory, and that sometimes the greatest acts are buried, waiting for a future brave enough to remember them. Sometimes the bravest act is not pulling a trigger. It is stepping forward when everyone else steps back. It is choosing truth when silence feels safer. Witold Pilecki did not change the outcome of the war. He did not live to see justice. But he proved something more enduring, that even in the darkest systems ever built, a single human being can refuse to become part of the darkness. And sometimes that refusal is enough to change how history remembers us.